The fluorescent lights in the logistics department flickered above Thelma Morgan's desk, casting long shadows on the stack of invoices she had volunteered to finish for a sick colleague. It was 9:42 p.m., and the rest of the floor had emptied hours ago. Her phone buzzed silently beside her takeout container, lighting up with a notification from Richard, "Don't forget to lock the door." No happy anniversary, no love you, not even a where are you. She closed the files, grabbed the lukewarm bag from Il Tramezzino's, his favorite grilled chicken panini, and headed home. Their apartment sat on the 5th floor of a modest red brick building, cozy and clean but filled with years of shared sacrifices. Thelma paused at the door, took a deep breath, and twisted the knob. Inside, the living room was dim. Richard sprawled on the couch watching a sports documentary, headphones in, completely oblivious to her entrance. The untouched anniversary card on the table stung more than any silence. She placed the food gently on the counter, careful not to disturb him. He didn't look up. Instead, Richard muttered something about needing quiet and waved his hand dismissively, as if she were some background character in his perfectly curated life. Thelma stared at him, eyes flickering between hurt and numbness. She remembered how they had met 6 years earlier. Richard was failing macroeconomics. She was a teaching assistant with a soft heart and a sharp mind. He was charming, ambitious, and unusually vulnerable. They'd bonded over late-night study sessions and bad cafeteria coffee. Back then, he admired her discipline, said he loved how her dreams weren't loud but unshakable. She thought they were building something permanent. But lately, his dreams had turned into Instagram reels and conference panels, flashy suits, and social climbing. And here they were now, on their 5th anniversary, her holding dinner in one hand and 100 unspoken disappointments in the other. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, watching a man who had once begged her to believe in him forget she existed. Later that night, after washing up and changing into her oversized sleep shirt, Thelma sat by the window, staring into the dark alley behind their building. Somewhere between the distant sirens and the hum of the city, she found herself tracing old letters her mother used to write in her journal. "You are a quiet storm, Thelma," her mother once said. "Not every storm needs thunder." That line used to comfort her, but tonight it only reminded her how unseen she'd become. She pulled out her planner and scratched out the dinner reservations she had made weeks ago, reservations he claimed were a waste of time. Her chest tightened as her fingers brushed against the gold locket she always wore, a memento from a childhood lost in her father's silence. She didn't cry. She just sat there, the skyline flickering in her glasses, silently wondering how long love could endure when it became so one-sided. And without realizing it, she began planning her next move. The following weekend, the apartment felt 10 degrees colder when Lydia Morgan swept through the front door in a cloud of designer perfume and judgment. She carried a handbag worth more than Thelma's monthly salary from just 2 years ago and wore an expression that made even the walls seem insufficient. Richard, ever the doting son in his mother's presence, rushed to take her coat, guiding her into the living room where Thelma had spent the morning cleaning and setting up a light brunch. Thelma greeted her with a soft smile and a firm handshake, but Lydia barely looked at her. "You've lost weight," she commented dryly, her eyes scanning Thelma from head to toe. "A little color wouldn't hurt." "Pale skin and thin arms?" "Not exactly trophy wife material." Richard chuckled awkwardly while sipping his coffee. Thelma clenched her jaw, suppressing every natural urge to defend herself. This wasn't the first visit, but something about Lydia's tone this time felt intentional. As brunch progressed, Thelma tried steering the conversation toward Richard's new property lead in Santa Monica or her own recent promotion, which had come with a quiet but hard-earned salary raise. But Lydia had other plans. "Tell me, dear, your people, where are they from again?" she asked, stirring her mimosa with far too much grace to be innocent. "I've never heard much about your side. Do they visit often, or are they just absent?" Thelma blinked. There it was. The carefully disguised jab at her mother's death, her father's vanishing act, and her solitary climb up the rungs of life. "My mother passed away a few years ago. She was a schoolteacher. Brilliant, compassionate. Everything I aspire to be," Thelma replied with dignity. Lydia tilted her head with a condescending pout. Oh, a teacher. That's modest. Richard said nothing. He sat with that distant smirk he often wore when his mother spoke, half amused, half absent. Thelma's eyes watered slightly, not from pain but from a simmering fire that had been slowly stoked for years. It wasn't the insult, it was the silence that hurt. After Lydia left, Thelma stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes while Richard scrolled through his phone on the couch, utterly detached. She didn't bring up the insults, nor did she ask why he never defended her. What was the point? That night, as he slept soundly beside her, Thelma sat alone in the bathroom with the door locked, flipping through an old photo album of her and her mother. Her mother's handwriting still filled the margins with quotes, dreams, and goals they'd both once shared. They may try to reduce you to where you came from. Remind them where you're going, one note read. She whispered it under her breath like a vow. The humiliation from Lydia's visit didn't break her, but it ignited something far deeper. Thelma had survived harder seasons than this. She wasn't angry anymore. She was awake. And the woman who had always been the pillar behind Richard's rise was about to rise alone. The invitation had arrived weeks in advance, an exclusive real estate investors' gala at the Marquis Grand Hotel, an opulent space bathed in velvet, glass, and ego. Thelma had helped Richard pick out his tie, had ironed her own emerald dress, even arranged to leave work early, all for one reason, to support him. As they entered the gold-lit ballroom, dozens of eyes turned to greet Richard, now slowly becoming a name whispered in property circles. Champagne flowed, jazz played, but Thelma couldn't shake the hollow sensation in her chest. Richard was walking ahead, greeting people, shaking hands like a man without a companion. She kept pace, smiling politely. That's when she saw her. Jasmine Carter. A striking woman in a wine-colored silk dress, hair cascading in effortless waves, laughing too loudly at Richard's jokes. When he introduced her, Richard simply said, "This is Jasmine, she's one of our new partners in development." Jasmine leaned in, touching his arm like they'd shared more than square footage. Throughout the night, Thelma watched subtle signs mutate into unbearable truths. Jasmine was everywhere Richard turned, refilling his glass, whispering in his ear, adjusting his collar with flirtatious precision. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe no one cared. Thelma felt like wallpaper. At one point, Jasmine approached her with the kind of smirk that women use when they've already decided how the story ends. "You're Thelma," she said, voice smooth as honey laced with venom. "I've heard so much about you. You're in logistics, right? It's amazing how strong support systems help men thrive." Thelma kept her composure, smiled. "Yes, support systems do matter. Though real strength shows when the spotlight's off." Jasmine's eyes glittered with passive aggression. "I liked you. You're quiet. Like a chess player." Thelma excused herself politely and slipped into the ladies' room, where she locked herself in a stall and let out a single, silent scream. It wasn't jealousy, it was the sickening realization that the shift had already begun. He wasn't hers anymore. Not really. Back at their table, Vanessa Rojas, Thelma's longtime friend and HR executive, leaned in. "I've been watching her," she murmured, eyes fixed on Jasmine. "She's not just a flirt, Thelma. She's strategic. That woman's hunting." Thelma tried to smile, but it cracked. "And Richard?" Vanessa shook her head. "He's already caught. You just haven't been told yet." Thelma sat still, fork resting on the edge of her untouched risotto. As applause erupted around them for one of Richard's speeches, she clapped politely, her eyes never leaving his face. He stood at the podium, voice polished, thanking his team, family, and those who believed in him. But he never once looked at her. That night, Thelma didn't confront him. She didn't plead, accuse, or cry. Instead, she went home and sat in front of her computer until dawn, staring at a blinking cursor in an empty document, typing the first line of what would become her contingency plan. The game had started, and she was no longer on defense. It was a Tuesday morning, one of those slow, gray ones where even the coffee tasted like rain. Thelma had taken the day off after working a marathon shift the previous weekend. She shuffled through a small pile of mail by the apartment door, sifting through advertisements, bills, and a single unmarked envelope, cream-colored, thick, and elegant with no return address. Her brows knit. It didn't look like junk. She opened it carefully, revealing a trifolded letter on embossed paper bearing the seal of a law firm she didn't recognize, Jefferson and Howe LLP. Her hands trembled slightly as she scanned the words. The letter was formal, almost clinical, informing her of a pending legal transfer connected to a sealed trust under her name. The sender requested a private appointment. No details. No explanations. Just a date, a time, and an address on Kingsbury Street. Her heart pounded, not with joy or dread, but confusion. She hadn't applied for anything. What trust? And from who? Thelma tucked the letter into her planner and sat down on the edge of their bed, legs numb. She stared at the mirror across from her and saw someone she hadn't looked at closely in weeks. Her skin had dulled, eyes looked heavier, and her smile was so rare now it almost felt imaginary. For years, she had buried every unanswered question about her father. Silas Fremont. The man who disappeared when she was 7 with a suitcase and a promise to send for her soon. He never did. The last time she saw him, he was buttoning his cuffs and looking past her like she was just a shadow in the hallway. Her mother never spoke ill of him, just said, "Your father chose the world, and I chose you." Thelma had accepted that silence like it was gospel, never questioning it too deeply. But this letter, it felt like a ghost knocking. Could it be him? Had he finally remembered her? Or worse? Was this someone else's mistake, a cruel coincidence about to collapse her fragile sanity? Later that evening, she debated whether or not to tell Richard. He was unusually cheerful, talking about a client meeting with promising people from Manhattan and a potential luxury development. He kissed her on the forehead and called her champ, like she was his assistant and not his wife. She smiled tightly, nodding along, but her mind was racing. If this letter turned out to be legitimate, if someone had actually left her a trust, assets, a connection to a past she thought was buried, it could change everything. But something deep in her gut whispered, "Keep it to yourself." Richard had changed. The warmth he once had now came in flashes, mostly reserved for others. So she said nothing. She kept her mystery folded neatly inside her planner and smiled through dinner. But that night, long after Richard had drifted to sleep beside her, Thelma lay wide awake, replaying every memory of her father's face, preparing herself for a truth she wasn't sure she wanted, but needed to hear. The scent of smoked brisket filled the air as Richard's family gathered for an outdoor cookout at Marcus Morgan's modest bungalow in the outskirts of Westchester. The atmosphere buzzed with laughter, drinks clinking, and unspoken hierarchies. Thelma moved through the crowd with her usual grace, offering side dishes, checking the grilled corn, pretending not to notice Lydia's sharp glances or Jasmine's name sliding casually into conversations. She'd already learned how to smile without engaging. Richard, as usual, stood at the center of attention, arms slung over shoulders, bragging about his pending partnerships. His success felt louder these days, louder than Thelma's silence, louder than his gratitude. Marcus, Richard's younger brother, was quieter, more thoughtful, never fully caught in the chase of appearances. As the sun began to dip behind the hedge, casting the backyard in golden haze, Marcus caught Thelma's eye and motioned her toward the side patio, far from the main gathering. His expression was unreadable, equal parts warning and concern. They stood near the wooden fence, just out of earshot, with Marcus chewing the inside of his cheek before speaking. "I don't want to overstep," he began, "but I know my brother. I know when he's chasing something more than money." Thelma frowned. "You mean Jasmine?" He nodded slowly. "I've seen her. At events. With him. It's not business anymore." The words hit her stomach like spoiled food, but she held her breath, saying nothing. Marcus continued. "Richard's not a bad man. But he's ambitious in a way that eats people. When someone becomes inconvenient or slows his momentum, he starts reshaping his life without telling them. He just phases them out. Thelma swallowed hard. It was exactly what she'd been feeling but had been too afraid to name. I'm telling you because I've seen what ambition did to our father. It left our mother drained, quiet, forgotten. And she never said a word. She just faded. Thelma turned her head, blinking back emotion. Marcus wasn't gossiping. He was grieving in advance, for her. That night, Thelma returned home and sat in their living room while Richard paced on the phone, speaking in animated tones about aligning with luxury clientele. He was planning another trip, one she wouldn't be going on. The moment he ended the call, she asked casually, "Do you still see Jasmine outside work?" He laughed like it was absurd. "Don't be dramatic, babe. She's a business asset." Then, without pausing, he added, "Marcus needs to learn to stay out of grown folks' business." Thelma didn't press. She just smiled faintly and turned back to her tea. Marcus' words echoed in her head, looping quietly, "He phases people out." She realized in that moment that Richard was already packing emotional bags she hadn't been invited to carry. But she had her own preparation now, her own unspoken moves. The mysterious inheritance. The appointment next week. And an inner storm that was quietly learning how to burn without warning anyone of the fire ahead. The law firm's office sat quietly on the 15th floor of an old granite building in Midtown, just far enough from downtown to feel forgotten, yet prestigious enough to signal power. Thelma stood in the elevator with palms sweating, her planner clutched tightly under her arm. She had told Richard she was grabbing lunch with Vanessa and silenced her phone. Her heels clicked softly against polished floors as she was ushered into a mahogany-paneled conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind the desk sat a silver-haired woman in a navy pantsuit who introduced herself as Clara Jefferson. Her tone was efficient but not cold, someone used to handling sensitive matters. "Ms. Morgan," she began, "your presence here today is pursuant to a sealed trust created over a decade ago by a Mr. Silas Fremont." Thelma's fingers froze. She hadn't heard that name spoken out loud since she was a child. Her throat dried instantly. "I'm sorry." "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. Clara continued, gently now. "Mr. Fremont initiated this trust upon relocating overseas. His legal directives were clear. The trust is to be managed privately until you reach age 29. Today, we are transferring the full controlling interest in his international shipping and logistics investments, real estate holdings, and securities to you." Thelma blinked, stunned. "He left?" Clara nodded. "Yes. Under complicated circumstances. He maintained minimal public contact, but always ensured this trust grew. He reviewed the holdings quarterly, even in recent months." Thelma tried to steady her breath as a manila folder was pushed toward her. She opened it, eyes widening at account summaries, property deeds, international holdings in her name. She felt faint. This wasn't just a nest egg, this was generational power. "But why not tell me?" she whispered. "His instructions were strict," Clara said. "He believed your protection came from distance, not association. But it was never abandonment. It was separation by design." Thelma wanted to scream, cry, demand more, but instead she nodded slowly. "Does anyone else know?" "Only me, and now you," Clara answered. "And it must remain that way until you choose otherwise." By the time Thelma returned to the apartment, the city had turned orange with sunset. She walked through the front door with her face composed and emotions locked in a vault deeper than any Clara had shown her. Richard was on a video call in the bedroom, his voice full of charm and ambition as he pitched some beachfront property. He didn't even notice her enter. She sat at the kitchen island, staring at the folder tucked inside her tote bag. Everything about her life had changed, except the world around her hadn't caught up yet. And she intended to keep it that way. She had no interest in parading wealth before a man who had begun to treat her like a placeholder. She would let him continue playing his games, planning his exits, building his castles in the air. Meanwhile, she would build an empire underground, quietly, powerfully, and far away from the spotlight he so desperately craved. And she would wait. The Hilton Sapphire Hotel glimmered like a jewel box under the Manhattan skyline, hosting an invitation-only gala for elite real estate developers. Richard received the RSVP through a luxury broker he had recently partnered with and insisted Thelma skip it, saying it was purely strategic and wouldn't interest her. That alone sent a ripple down her spine, but she smiled and said she understood. In truth, she had already grown used to the sharp ways in which Richard excluded her from his newer, glossier life. What he didn't know was that Brian, her longtime confidant and former roommate, worked as a senior tech consultant with the same PR firm organizing the event. Brian had no patience for deceit, especially when it involved Thelma. That evening, after glancing through the camera feed of the gala, Brian sent her a short message: "Don't ask questions. Just know he's not alone. And she's not a colleague." Thelma closed the message and exhaled. So it had begun. Jasmine was dressed to command, floor-length emerald gown with a slit daring enough to start wars, diamond studs shimmering like secrets in the candlelight. She floated beside Richard like a curated accessory, her laughter soft but deliberate, her hand often brushing his suit lapel or looping around his wrist. To the untrained eye, she appeared to be just another professional woman enjoying an exclusive event. But to Brian, and anyone watching closely, she was staging her rise, and Richard was more than willing to be her ladder. At one point, when the cameras turned away and the spotlights dimmed between segments, Jasmine leaned in close and whispered something into Richard's ear that made him chuckle and lower his gaze like a teenager. They kissed, briefly, behind the champagne tower, assuming no one noticed. But Brian, tucked in the tech booth above the floor, zoomed in and captured everything. He didn't send the footage to Thelma, not yet. She deserved to handle it her way, when she was ready. The next morning, Brian met Thelma at a quiet corner cafe off Delancey Street. He looked nervous, unshaven, unsure if he was doing the right thing. He kissed her, he finally said, placing his phone on the table. "You need to see what you're dealing with." Thelma didn't flinch. She simply sipped her black coffee, her eyes fixed out the window. "I believe you," she said softly. "But I don't need to see it." Brian leaned forward, surprised. "You're not going to confront him?" Thelma smiled, not bitterly, but like someone who had already skipped past fury and found strategy. "Not yet. I'm building something. Let him underestimate me a little longer." Her voice was steady, calm. But inside, something colder was forming. Not revenge. Something smarter. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't beg. She would rise, and when she did, Richard and Jasmine wouldn't even realize the storm was hers until it was too late. And that knowledge was her fuel. Something about Richard changed after that gala. Not in ways most people would notice immediately, but Thelma, who knew him better than anyone, saw the transformation begin like a slow virus spreading through his personality. He started waking earlier, working out longer, obsessing over every crease in his bespoke shirts. He no longer asked for her opinion on client decks or late-night proposals. Instead, he spent hours reviewing real estate influencer pages, mimicking their speech and style, memorizing which champagne brands photographed best under chandelier light. Even his laugh changed, hollow, performative, like he was rehearsing life for someone else. Thelma would watch him from across their kitchen table as he edited captions for social media posts she didn't appear in, filtered his voice in videos she hadn't been told were filmed. He became more polished, yes, but also more absent. As if every polished thing he added to himself was meant to bury the version of him she had once loved. He began traveling more, quick overnight meetings in Chicago, client presentations in Miami, and impromptu visits to steady the Beverly Hills market. Thelma never asked questions. She just nodded and packed his toiletries like a dutiful spouse. But inside, she was documenting everything. While Richard was flying to California with Jasmine in tow, Thelma quietly set up a meeting with Brian to finalize the offshore structuring of her private holding company. She gave the company a name that only she understood, Red Lantern Holdings, a nod to a childhood memory where her mother once lit a red lantern and said, "This light stays on until you get home." Thelma smiled sadly at the memory. Home wasn't a place anymore, it was her future. She quietly wired money from the accounts Clara had helped her access, acquiring shares in 3 shipping depots, leasing a storage wing near the Hudson, and purchasing a duplex in an upscale neighborhood under a blind trust. Richard never noticed. He was too busy posing on rooftops, too busy crafting illusions. The new Richard didn't even pretend to include her anymore. One night, while brushing his teeth, he casually remarked, "If I ever do a rebrand, I think I'll lean into the luxury bachelor thing. Just for marketing purposes, you know?" Thelma had paused, turned to him slowly, toothbrush in hand. "Bachelor?" she asked. He chuckled and said, "Just an idea. Clients love an aesthetic." Then he kissed her forehead and walked into the bedroom like he hadn't just peeled back a piece of their foundation and dropped it down a well. That night, Thelma sat up scrolling through real estate listings in his name, properties he hadn't disclosed, joint ventures she was not part of. She didn't cry. She didn't confront. Instead, she called Clara the next morning and asked a single question: "How soon can I expand?" There was a quiet war beginning, and she intended to win without ever drawing a sword. Let him play the bachelor. She was building an empire. Lydia Morgan had never been subtle, but when she summoned Richard to lunch at her favorite private dining club, the Baythorn Room, it wasn't just for idle gossip or her usual veiled critiques. She had heard whispers. Jasmine's name was circling in Westchester's old money circles, and Richard's name was now being linked to more than just profitable development deals. Seated across from her son in a rose-gold velvet booth, Lydia sipped on her lemon spritz and got straight to the point. "This situation with Thelma," she said, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision, "is becoming a liability." Richard blinked. "She's my wife." Lydia arched a brow. "She was useful when you were climbing, but you're not climbing anymore. You're there. You need a partner who reflects that." Then came the offer: if Richard cut ties with Thelma and made a clean break, Lydia would connect him to 3 key investors and gift him a plot of commercial land in Coral Springs. "You can't ascend dragging sentiment," she whispered coldly. Richard left that lunch with his mind spinning. He hadn't expected it so direct. His mother had always hated Thelma, of course, but this was more than disapproval. This was a strategic proposition. It didn't help that Jasmine had already begun seeding doubts. She had the finesse to make her jabs feel like compliments. "Your wife's sweet, but she doesn't really get what you do, does she?" Or, "You need someone who walks beside you, not behind." Richard didn't admit it out loud, but those words fed something ugly in him, something that wanted to be envied, admired, photographed. That week, he scheduled a business trip to Bali, claiming it was a networking retreat. Thelma offered no resistance, even helped pack his cufflinks. When he left, he didn't just walk out of the apartment, he walked out of the last real thread of truth in their marriage. What he didn't know was that Thelma had already seen the reservations. Jasmine's name was on the confirmation email. She simply forwarded it to a folder titled "For Later" and sent him off with a kiss on the cheek. On the flight, Jasmine leaned her head on Richard's shoulder, posting selfies with cryptic captions: "Building more than dreams #island life." They arrived to White Sands, private villas, and candlelit dinners, everything curated to reflect success. Meanwhile, back in New York, Thelma was signing new contracts with her legal team, expanding her logistics portfolio, and securing a 3rd commercial lease under her holding company. Clara had warned her, "There will be a moment when you'll want to confront him. Don't let him bury himself in his illusions. You build." Thelma listened. She no longer sought validation from a man hypnotized by aesthetics. He had made his choice. Now she was making hers. When she watched Jasmine's photos circulate online, all she did was smile, because what neither of them knew was that the island resort they were staying in had recently been acquired by an anonymous New York trust. Her trust. Every cocktail they sipped was on her tab. Richard returned from Bali with a tan, a stronger jawline from excessive smirking, and a new cologne that smelled nothing like the man Thelma had once fallen in love with. He entered their apartment without knocking, humming a tune and casually placing his suitcase by the door like he hadn't just spent 10 days playing husband to another woman. Thelma, dressed in a simple gray sweater and jeans, was seated at the kitchen counter reading over a contract, her 5th acquisition deal this quarter. "How was your business trip?" she asked coolly. Richard didn't even pause. "Productive," he said, stretching. "Met some incredible people. Big things are coming." He didn't mention Jasmine. He didn't need to. The silence between them spoke in paragraphs. Later that evening, as he scrolled through social media and double-tapped Jasmine's photos with reckless abandon, Thelma forwarded a silent transfer order, converting the last visible joint assets into separate legal entities under her shell corporation. Quiet exits, she believed, were the loudest. The next morning, Richard stood near the window holding a cup of coffee and staring into the New York skyline like it owed him something. "We need to talk," he finally said. Thelma turned slowly, pretending to be surprised. "About what?" He hesitated, then spoke, rehearsed and hollow. "I think we've grown apart. We're different people now. I've evolved, and I think we both know this isn't working anymore." Thelma tilted her head, absorbing every syllable. "You've evolved," she repeated. "Into what?" He avoided her eyes. "Into who I need to be." Then came the final blow. "I'm seeing someone. I didn't plan it, but it happened." Thelma didn't scream. Didn't cry. Didn't ask who. She simply stood up, walked to the drawer, and handed him the neatly folded divorce documents she had prepared 2 weeks ago. "Sign them when you're ready," she said. Richard stared at her, stunned. "You knew?" She smiled. "I knew the moment you started liking her photos more than mine. You just didn't realize I stopped needing your approval months ago." As Richard packed his bags and left, Thelma stood in the hallway, watching the door click shut behind him. No theatrics. No begging. Just a quiet, deliberate end. She turned back toward the apartment, now hers alone, and exhaled deeply, like someone shedding the final weight of a long, exhausting disguise. The woman he had left behind was no longer the one he had married. That woman had outgrown her shell. That woman now owned businesses he would never hear about, held real estate in cities he could never afford, and wielded power wrapped in silence. She poured herself a glass of chilled citrus water and turned on soft jazz, not as a distraction but as an anthem. This wasn't heartbreak. This was recalibration. Richard had made the mistake of thinking she would fall apart without him. But she wasn't broken. She was unlocking. And with him gone, there was finally space for the woman she had been quietly building to emerge fully, fiercely, and without apology. The morning after Richard left, Thelma didn't wake up crying. She didn't roll over to an empty side of the bed and stare at the ceiling. Instead, she woke early, brewed black coffee, and packed her essentials into a single overnight bag. She left the apartment without looking back. Vanessa's condo in Brooklyn had always been a sanctuary, warm, earthy-toned, filled with plants and incense and late-night truths. When Thelma walked in and dropped her bag on the hardwood floor, Vanessa looked up from her laptop, said nothing, and just opened her arms. They sat on the couch for hours, Thelma curled up like a child, speaking in fragments between gulps of tea. She recounted the betrayal not like someone broken, but like a surgeon giving a post-op report, precise, methodical, detached. But when she mentioned the resort being hers, the inheritance, the secret empire forming beneath the surface, Vanessa dropped her mug. "Wait, you own that place?" Thelma nodded. And then she laughed, for the first time in months. Later that evening, they sat around the kitchen island, laptops open, whiteboards filled with names of holding companies, shell firms, asset links, and logistics chains. Brian joined via video call, eyes wide with admiration and disbelief. "So basically, you're already a silent tycoon," he joked, "and no one knows it." Thelma smiled faintly. Exactly how I want it. Vanessa leaned forward. It's time you moved into something that reflects the woman you are, not the woman you were trying to be for him. Thelma opened her email and clicked on a message from Clara Jefferson. Attached were keys, figurative and literal, to a brownstone townhouse in Soho, purchased months earlier in a blind trust. Fully furnished. No mortgages. No questions. I think I'm ready, Thelma whispered. And she was. Ready to live not reactively but deliberately. Ready to build without carrying someone else's ambition on her back. Richard had walked out thinking he was leveling up. But Thelma wasn't climbing the same ladder, she had built her own skyscraper. 2 days later, Thelma stepped into her new home. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, reflecting off sleek granite countertops and honeywood floors. Every inch of the space whispered autonomy. She opened the closet to find it already stocked, simple, elegant pieces, all tailored to her measurements. Clara had thought of everything. She stood in the center of the living room, listening to the silence that felt nothing like loneliness. It was peace. From that moment, she no longer saw herself as the woman Richard left, she saw herself as the woman who let him go. She didn't need closure from him, because her victory wasn't revenge, it was reinvention. Thelma reached into her bag, pulled out a document titled Red Lantern Logistics, Phase 2 Expansion, and placed it on the desk. She had work to do. Not for survival. Not for proving a point. But because she was ready to step into the life she had spent years preparing for in secret. Her rebirth had begun, and this time, she would not apologize for her power. The atrium sky lounge sparkled with floor-to-ceiling windows and shimmering chandeliers that caught every camera flash and cocktail reflection. It was the night of the Horizon Tower unveiling, an exclusive luxury high-rise Richard had helped broker for a high-profile investor group. The press swarmed in droves, real estate moguls mingled in tuxedos and velvet gowns, and Jasmine floated beside Richard in a rose-gold slit dress like the crown jewel she believed she had become. This was their moment. Photographers surrounded them as Richard, beaming, led her to the glass podium at center stage to give his big speech. This tower, he said confidently, is a symbol of dreams made real through vision and collaboration. As applause echoed, a large LED screen lit up with the logo of the owning firm. Richard froze mid-sentence. The firm's name, Red Lantern Holdings, gleamed in crimson across the screen. Guests murmured. Investors turned toward each other. Jasmine whispered, "Who's that?" But Richard already knew. His hands trembled on the microphone. Backstage, Thelma stood behind the velvet curtain, arms folded, watching everything unfold. She wasn't here to gloat, she was here to make a statement. Not one born of vengeance, but of quiet reclamation. Brian stood beside her, monitoring the digital screens while Vanessa, now Director of Talent and Culture for Red Lantern, handled investor handshakes with practiced elegance. No one had known Thelma was behind the company. She'd moved with surgical precision, acquiring, consolidating, and empowering key silent partners. Horizon Tower wasn't just another high-rise. It was a flagship asset. The irony? Richard had spent months trying to buy into a project his ex-wife already owned. She never had to say a word to him. She didn't need to. As he fumbled through the rest of his speech and thanked unknown benefactors, the audience clapped politely, but the energy had shifted. Jasmine tried to regain control, posing for photos. But her smile faltered when she saw Vanessa at the center of the VIP ring. Something was off. Very off. And Jasmine hated not being the smartest woman in the room. After the event, Richard spotted Thelma quietly exiting through a side corridor, her black satin gown flowing behind her like smoke. For a moment, time froze. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, just a long, loaded silence that carried everything he never saw coming. She nodded once, calm, poised, untouchable, and walked away. That was her slap. Not with hands or humiliation, but with dominance delivered in grace. Richard stood there, stunned, while Jasmine pulled at his sleeve with forced charm. "Let's head to the after-party," she said. But Richard didn't move. In that moment, he understood something irreversible. He hadn't just lost a woman, he had overlooked a phenomenon. Thelma had not simply rebuilt herself. She had outgrown the entire world he thought he controlled. And now, she owned the floors beneath his feet. All he could do was watch her disappear into the future he never saw her building. The email arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, subject line, confidential, executor notification. Thelma had just finished reviewing customs clearance protocols for a new shipping terminal acquisition when her phone buzzed. The sender was Clara Jefferson. The body of the message was brief, almost clinical. Silas Fremont has passed. Immediate appearance requested at the reading of his final will. Private attendance only. Thelma read it twice, then a third time, her chest hollowing out with a strange, weightless ache. It wasn't sadness exactly, not in the way one mourns a father they knew and loved. No, this grief came with sharp edges and unfinished sentences. She remembered a different Silas, a man with cologne that smelled like cedarwood and ambition, who taught her chess at age 6, then vanished the week after her 7th birthday. No note. No goodbye. Her mother never cried about him, but the silence around his name had always hung in the air like smoke. Now, that smoke was becoming flame. The law office was darker than she remembered, same walnut-paneled walls, same scent of leather and something old. Clara waited inside, face unreadable, a single manila folder in her hand. He died in Geneva, Clara said softly. Massive cardiac arrest. He was 71. Alone. Thelma sat, unsure of what she felt. Clara slid the folder across the table. His final letter to you. And updated directives. Thelma opened the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting was unmistakably Silas, looped, elegant, and confident. My daughter, it began, I do not ask for forgiveness, for I know I don't deserve it. But I need you to know, leaving was never abandonment. It was protection, from my enemies, from my mistakes, from the life that would have broken you had I stayed. I watched from a distance. I built in your name. And I hoped, one day, you'd find the fire I saw in your mother's eyes. You did. I'm proud. I'm sorry. Thelma didn't cry. But her hands went cold. Even in death, he was both a stranger and her origin. Clara handed her another envelope, this one thicker. He updated the trust. You now own his remaining overseas assets, 2 cargo ports in Morocco and Singapore, for patents on container tracking software, and 20% equity in the Tri-Atlantic Freight Corridor. Thelma stared blankly. The numbers were staggering. But it wasn't the wealth that shook her, it was the finality. Her father's story had ended, and with it, the last ghost of her childhood was buried. She stepped out of the law firm into the sharp autumn air, letting it hit her face like a slap. Somewhere inside, she had always held a childish belief that one day he'd reappear and explain everything. That maybe her abandonment had meaning. But real closure doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes, it comes with keys. That night, in her penthouse overlooking the East River, Thelma stood barefoot by the glass, sipping tea in silence. She didn't mourn Silas. She mourned the little girl who waited for him. It started with an anonymous message delivered to Jasmine's personal assistant at the showroom, a small, sealed envelope with no return name, only the words "For Jasmine Carter" written in bold black ink. Inside was a single photograph of her, 5 years ago, platinum blonde, perched on the lap of a man with tattoos down his forearm and a cigarette between his fingers. Dean Walters. Her ex. A name she had erased like graffiti from a clean white wall. Beneath the photo was a note, "Tell your golden boy the truth before I do. Or I'll be the one making headlines." Jasmine's hands trembled as she reread the words. Dean had once been her entire world, until he wasn't. He had gone to prison for financial fraud, but not before funneling large sums of stolen crypto into accounts they had jointly opened. She'd walked away clean. Or so she thought. Now, the past she had rebranded was clawing at her designer heels, and it wanted payment. Dean showed up 3 days later, leaning against a Bentley that wasn't his, wearing a smug grin and sunglasses like he was auditioning for a crime drama. He intercepted her outside of an upscale lounge in Midtown, where she and Richard had just wrapped a dinner with investors. "Hello, Jazz," he drawled. "Miss me?" Jasmine froze mid-step, hoping Richard wouldn't notice. Dean removed his glasses and stepped forward, close enough for only her to hear. "You've come a long way. Boutique owner. Trophy girl. But I know where the bones are buried. And so will your darling Richard, unless you make it worth my silence." She forced a smile and ushered Dean away, lying that he was an old vendor she needed to handle. But she couldn't stop shaking. Richard didn't ask many questions, he was too high on compliments from that night's deals. Yet Jasmine felt the walls around her life, walls she had constructed from seduction and strategy, beginning to crack, brick by dangerous brick. That evening, Jasmine sat alone in her apartment, digging through old emails, old transfers, trying to see how exposed she really was. Dean had everything: voice recordings, copies of offshore accounts, even stolen jewelry receipts that linked back to her days laundering his assets. She had always believed reinvention was a matter of perfect appearance, but Dean was proof that no past stays buried forever. Worse, her current life wasn't built to withstand scandal. If Richard found out, she'd lose the apartment, the showroom, the investors, the public praise. She'd finally landed the life she thought she deserved, but it was hanging by a thread. She couldn't sleep. She didn't know who else Dean had contacted. Her anxiety clawed at her skin. The perfect mask she wore daily, gilded, smug, seductive, now weighed like lead. She realized something chilling: Dean wasn't bluffing. And for the first time in years, Jasmine Carter wasn't the one pulling the strings. She was the one being hunted. The cracks in Richard's empire didn't begin with a scandal, they started with silence. A phone call unanswered. An investor who suddenly rescheduled indefinitely. A junior analyst quitting without warning, citing a toxic environment. At first, Richard shrugged these off. His confidence had always been more illusion than foundation. But then came the email from his main capital partner in Los Angeles: "We're reevaluating based on new concerns." Your name came up in a flagged inquiry. Richard's hands froze on his keyboard. He called, but it went straight to voicemail. He called again, nothing. Within 48 hours, 2 of his major developments were placed under review. Jasmine had grown distant, always managing her boutique or meeting vendors, but she wouldn't look him in the eye. He noticed her phone was always on silent. One night, after she fell asleep, he checked it. The name Dean popped up in 3 missed calls. The hair on Richard's neck stood. Something was wrong, very wrong, and he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. Richard tried to salvage what he could. He went into PR overdrive, posting motivational quotes, throwing together investor meetups, and announcing exclusive acquisitions that hadn't even closed. But behind the scenes, everything was bleeding. Jasmine had become unpredictable, cold, distracted, paranoid. She no longer cared to play the perfect accessory. When he pressed her about Dean, she deflected, snapping that his paranoia would be the end of him. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Rumors were swirling. Blogs had begun to hint that one of Richard's celebrity real estate deals had a silent conflict of interest. Then came the devastating leak. Someone anonymously tipped off a financial watchdog about undeclared holdings Richard tried to channel through Jasmine's showroom as a laundering point. Though the investigation hadn't named names, it was enough to rattle his reputation. Calls stopped. Emails dried. Richard, once the glittering boy wonder of urban development, found himself locked out of his own conference rooms. The golden door he had climbed through was now slammed shut and bolted from the inside. Desperate, Richard called his brother Marcus. They met at a quiet diner far from the city. Richard looked drained, bags under his eyes, the collar of his once-tailored coat now wrinkled. "I think I made a mistake," he admitted quietly. Marcus stirred his coffee slowly. "Which one?" he asked, not sarcastically, just tired. Richard didn't answer. Thelma warned me about ambition, Marcus said. But she never fought you. She let you win. That's how you lost. Richard dropped his head in his hands. I thought Jasmine was the upgrade. Marcus laughed, not with humor, but disbelief. You mistook glitter for gold. Richard left that meeting with nothing resolved. That night, Jasmine didn't come home. A quick check of her closet showed several of her designer bags missing. She was gone, without a note, without closure. Richard stood in his penthouse, surrounded by silence and unpaid invoices, realizing too late that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his only anchor. And now, he was drifting fast. While storms raged in Richard's crumbling empire, a different kind of chapter was unfolding in the life of Vanessa Rojas. Thelma's best friend in rock for over a decade, Vanessa had quietly been growing her own career and healing from an emotionally abusive relationship she'd ended 3 years prior. Through her work as director of talent and culture at Red Lantern, she'd begun collaborating with an international wine distribution company whose logistics now ran through Thelma's private shipping routes. It was during one of these partnership retreats in Napa Valley that Vanessa met Elias Brandt, a former military pilot turned vineyard owner with hands that spoke the language of soil and honesty. He wasn't flashy. He didn't talk in Instagram captions. He was deeply grounded, fiercely kind, and utterly smitten with Vanessa from the moment she corrected his mispronunciation of Tempranillo. They talked late into the nights, about grief, legacy, ambition, and the terrifying beauty of starting over. Their romance blossomed away from the chaos of skyscrapers and corporate power games. Elias invited Vanessa to help design a wine-tasting experience curated for diverse palates, something that celebrated cultural roots rather than diluted them. She had never felt so seen. When Thelma visited the vineyard weeks later, she saw a version of her best friend she hadn't seen in years, relaxed, laughing, barefoot on gravel as she tasted wild cherry blends from aged barrels. He's different, Vanessa confessed one night under the stars. He listens without waiting to speak. And when I laugh, I don't wonder if I sound too much. Thelma smiled knowingly. Vanessa had been her emotional compass for years. Now it was her turn to witness Vanessa's joy. One afternoon, while exploring the east wing of the vineyard's guest house, Elias led Vanessa to a small table near the greenhouse. A single ring sat in the center, simple, gold, and breathtaking in its honesty. No performance, he said. Just a promise, to walk beside you, not ahead of you. She said yes through tears. The wedding was set in the very heart of the vineyard 6 months later, with only 30 guests, each one handpicked from the pages of their lives. Thelma stood proudly as maid of honor, dressed in deep navy silk, her eyes misting as Vanessa walked down the aisle to a gentle Spanish guitar. The ceremony was serene, laced with heartfelt vows and echoes of resilience. Afterward, guests clinked glasses under fairy lights while the bride and groom danced barefoot on the vineyard lawn. For Thelma, it wasn't just about witnessing love, it was about healing. In Vanessa's happiness, she saw proof that life didn't always end where pain began. Later that night, Elias raised a toast, to the people who held us together when we didn't even know we were falling apart. Thelma glanced at her friend, heart full. In a world where betrayals whispered through corridors, this moment roared like a hymn. It was joy, untainted. A reminder that some stories end in beginnings. The media had been circling for weeks, whispers of a mysterious logistics empire reshaping commercial shipping on both U.S. coasts and across 3 international corridors. Rumors pointed to a faceless holding group with explosive growth, luxury real estate investments, and anonymous leadership. Blogs speculated. Analysts guessed. But no one had names until that Monday morning. Forbes released its annual Under 35 Titans of Industry issue, and splashed across the digital cover was an image no one expected: Thelma Morgan, elegantly poised in a charcoal double-breasted suit, arms crossed, standing in front of a freighter ship bearing the Red Lantern Holdings insignia. The headline read, "The Silent Storm, How Thelma Morgan Quietly Built a Global Empire." Within hours, her name trended across platforms. Her photo flashed across Times Square. Emails flooded her assistants. The woman everyone thought had faded quietly after a high-profile divorce was, in fact, the architect of one of the most powerful logistics and infrastructure portfolios in the Northern Hemisphere. Richard saw the cover while standing in line at a downtown coffee shop. It hit him like a punch to the gut. He grabbed a copy, opened it, and began flipping through page after page detailing Thelma's journey, her career in shipping analytics, the hidden inheritance, the corporate restructuring, the shell companies, and the methodical expansion across global markets. She had bought the very buildings he once bragged about pitching to. She'd formed strategic alliances with maritime boards, disrupted container logistics with smart tracking patents, and become the silent majority stakeholder in firms his own investors had abandoned him to chase. Her name was everywhere now, on lips, on screens, and conversations Richard was no longer invited into. But the most devastating blow came from a single quote at the end of the article. "I never disappeared," Thelma had said. "I was just building in a quieter lane." Richard dropped the magazine. The irony sliced deeper than any betrayal. The woman he had cast aside had not just survived, she had outgrown his entire world. At Red Lantern headquarters, Thelma sat in her corner office surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass and sunlight. Brian leaned against the window holding 2 cups of coffee, watching as their media team filtered through interviews and press requests. "You broke the internet," he joked, setting her drink down. Vanessa walked in moments later, tossing a handful of congratulatory letters on her desk. "Harvard Business Review wants you for a keynote," she smirked. Thelma just nodded, calm, composed, unmoved by the noise. She hadn't done any of this for applause. She had built in the shadows because it was where she felt safe. But now, the spotlight was unavoidable. She took a deep breath and looked at her reflection in the glass. There was no longer any trace of the woman who once sat silent in her own marriage, hoping to be seen. Now, the world couldn't look away. Thelma had become the storm they never saw coming, and the calm that would outlast them all. The invitation arrived folded in ivory linen paper, simple yet elegant, in celebration of Elias and Vanessa Branch Union, a vineyard garden reception. Thelma had helped organize the event, curating every detail with care, but one guest remained a surprise, at least to her. As twilight descended over the vineyard and fairy lights blinked like stars above the trees, Richard arrived quietly, dressed in charcoal and hesitation. He wasn't invited directly, but Elias had extended the courtesy out of respect. Thelma saw him from across the lawn, standing awkwardly near a rose bush, champagne in hand but untouched. She didn't flinch. Didn't hide. Instead, she walked toward him with deliberate calm. The crowd melted into the background as they stood face to face for the first time in over a year. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was loaded with things too late to change and too heavy to revisit. "Congratulations," he said finally. She smiled gently. "Not mine to receive. But thank you." Richard studied her for a moment longer, his eyes searching for remnants of the woman he once knew. But Thelma had changed, and not just in appearance. Her energy was different, rooted, impenetrable, serene. "You look whole," he admitted. "I am," she replied without arrogance, only truth. He glanced at the vineyard's expanse, then back at her. "I didn't know what I had," he said softly. "I know," she answered, and that was enough. There was no need for apologies, no pleas for forgiveness. Their story had ended long ago, what remained now was acknowledgement. Not regret. Just reality. "I heard about Jasmine," she said, almost as an afterthought. Richard shook his head. "She left. Took more than money. Took pieces of who I thought I was." Thelma nodded, understanding more than she let on. Sometimes, losing what's false is the only way to see what's true. He didn't ask to come back. And she didn't offer a door. That moment wasn't for reconciliation, it was for recognition. And both accepted it. As the music swelled and guests raised glasses under the golden dusk, Richard excused himself and walked to his car. He didn't look back. Thelma remained, her heels crunching gently on gravel as she returned to the laughter and light. Vanessa caught her eye and smiled knowingly. Brian lifted a toast in her direction. She returned to her place at the table, not as someone's wife or ex, but as herself. A woman who had lost nothing worth keeping and gained everything she never expected. There was no bitterness in her chest, no resentment in her bones. Just peace. She leaned back in her seat, sipping chilled wine, watching the vines sway in the soft breeze. Richard was part of her past, but not her pain. He had written one chapter, but she had authored the rest. And now, in this moment of quiet freedom, Thelma understood the rarest kind of closure, the kind that requires nothing except walking away without needing to win. Thelma stood at the gates of the private cemetery in Vermont, the late autumn leaves swirling around her boots in quiet reverence. Beside her stood Nora Fremont, her late father's sister and the executor of the final trust documents. Thelma had delayed this visit for months, unsure what emotions might erupt at the final resting place of Silas Fremont. But standing there now, under the gray sky and the weight of her journey, she felt nothing but a quiet ache. No anger. No nostalgia. Just a deep breath of finality. She stepped forward, placing a single folded letter on the granite headstone. For the years you never returned, she whispered. And for the legacy I learned to carry without your hand. Nora said little, respecting the silence. She had once doubted Thelma, believed her to be a broken remnant of Silas' failures. But now, she saw a Titan dressed in simplicity. A woman who bore her inheritance not as armor, but as truth. Later that week, Thelma returned to the Red Lantern headquarters, tall glass, polished wood, and curated stillness that overlooked the East River like a quiet sentinel. It wasn't just a company. It was a monument to endurance. To dignity. To reinvention. The logistics empire now employed nearly 2,000 staff across 6 countries, with contracts tied to shipping lanes, luxury real estate, and aviation cargo. But Thelma wasn't in it for headlines or clout. She focused on infrastructure, sustainability, efficiency, on making quiet systems work so loudly that the world couldn't ignore their ripple. She no longer attended board meetings to prove herself. She chaired them because she'd earned the seat. Vanessa now headed the culture department with warmth and vision. Brian served as CTO, developing tools that improved port efficiency by 40%. They weren't just employees, they were her chosen family. Together, they built something permanent. Something she could point to and say, this was mine. And I built it from the pieces he left behind. One evening, after a particularly long conference call with her Singapore team, Thelma walked into her private suite and opened a vault, one only she and Clara had access to. Inside weren't gold bars or money, but blueprints, journals, letters from her mother, voice recordings of her own thoughts through the years. It was a time capsule of every scar, every climb, every whisper of doubt she had ever turned into steel. She sat on the floor and ran her fingers across a worn notebook page her mother once wrote. You're more than what they see. More than what they say. You are the storm and the sunrise. Thelma closed her eyes, smiling softly. The world saw her as a woman reborn after betrayal. But she knew the truth. She hadn't been reborn. She had always been whole. She had only been buried beneath expectation. Now she was living proof that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. And what she had built would outlast them all. The sunrise broke gently over the Manhattan skyline, casting a soft golden hue through the all-glass facade of Red Lantern's new global headquarters, a towering architectural marvel that now overlooked both the shipping docks and the corporate core of the city. Thelma stood alone on the rooftop garden, a mug of black coffee cradled in her hands, wrapped in a cream wool coat, her curls catching the wind like poetry in motion. Around her, the world was waking, but inside her, something had already awakened long ago. She no longer woke in fear of being underestimated. She no longer shrank to accommodate others. She no longer looked for permission to lead. This morning, as she stared out at the horizon, she wasn't thinking about Richard, Jasmine, or the betrayals behind her. She was thinking about what was ahead, new terminals in Lagos and Dubai, a mentorship program she was funding in her mother's name, and a life authored solely on her own terms. Brian and Vanessa joined her moments later, coffee in hand, laughter in their eyes, the bond between them no longer built on survival but on shared triumph. Vanessa leaned on the ledge beside her, flashing her wedding ring, now carrying Elias's baby, and glowing with the kind of joy Thelma had once believed was reserved for other people. Brian pointed toward the street below, where dozens of employees filed into the grand lobby for orientation. They don't even know whose dream they're working in, he joked. Thelma smiled. They don't need to. They just need to dream their own. Downstairs, the media prepared for a press reveal, but Thelma wouldn't be attending. She'd said everything she needed to say by building what others believed impossible. As they clinked their mugs quietly under the rising sun, Thelma whispered, "We're just getting started." And in that moment, she didn't feel victorious, she felt free. Not from anyone, but for herself. For the life she chose to live fully, fiercely, and without apology. By noon, she had turned off her phone, stepped into the town car, and directed her driver toward the coast. No schedule. No press. No boardrooms. Just time. As they passed the docks, those same ports that had once represented her past, Thelma stared at the water with reverence, not regret. She thought of her mother. She thought of the little girl who once waited at the window, hoping her father would return. That girl was gone now. In her place stood a woman who had never needed rescue, only room to rise. When the car pulled up to the beach house she rarely used, she stepped out barefoot and walked across the sand, her coat fluttering behind her. There were no cameras. No expectations. Just the sound of waves, and the whisper of wind through the dunes. And as she stood there alone, smiling softly to herself, Thelma knew this wasn't a new chapter, it was a new book. And this time, every word was hers. The end.